heard this magazine article recently said the 4 things men most worry about, their own personal vanity, is their hair, their height, their penis size, their income. I went, man, at least I'm tall. You want me to go through that list one more time?
Good morning. It's Saturday, the Enemies of My Country Saturday, November the 4th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, bishop-barron, Ayn Rand, and Vivek Ramaswamy, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
To the extent that the years between the end of World War II and today are a story of competing economic visions, the short version is this: Karl Marx was wrong and Milton Friedman was right. Market-oriented reforms over the past several decades have cut severe poverty around the world by more than half. As late as 1980, more than 40% of the world's population lived in severe poverty, according to World Bank figures. Now that share is less than 10%. There is simply nothing else in the history of the material affairs of the world that can compare to that. Kevin Williamson. Marx versus Friedman or Marx versus Smith is a useful framing of the subject of this book, though perhaps more simplistic than I prefer. And as a prima facie glance into the fruits on the tree of each respective school of thought, one can do worse than to look at what free enterprise has meant in reducing poverty versus the collective well-being conditions of the communist bloc countries. If the most rapid reduction in extreme poverty in world history is not prima facie reason to embrace market economics, I stand confused as to what our aim here is.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
And it didn't require outright revolution or, actual bloodshed. By the time I got to Columbia, all of the principal issues had been as settled as the settled science of global warming, or climate change, or whatever we're going to call it tomorrow. And so it was given to us now to put them into practice. By the time we left school, we were a well-trained cadre of destruction, ready to seize upon any agent of change, no matter how idiotic, and know that our friends in academia and the media would help us sell it to a distracted and demoralized American public. And you bought it, hook, line, and stink bomb, because we understood the first rule or two of sales, which are A, there's a sucker born every minute, and B, the sucker only buys what he's already disposed to buy. Had we tried to sell you this load of errant codswallop in the 1950s, or even the early 1960s, you would have called the cops on us. But timing is everything. For we are nothing if not incrementalists. This is where you always make your fatal mistake. It is the age-old struggle between strategy and tactics, between the drive on Berlin and the bridge at Remagen. Since we don't have real jobs, surely teaching at Harvard and working in the State Department, or having a Rhodes Scholar show on MSNBC doesn't qualify as a real job by anybody's standard. Certainly not by those standards you and farmer factory worker flyover country consider real. We have plenty of time to plot and plan strategy, while you lot consider the odd electoral victory here and there as proof of your superior moral and popular virtue. To which my dad Che and I say, ha! How well I remember the traumatic evening of the election of 1984, even though I was only 7 years old. What misery. I can still see the horrified faces of Che and Uncle Joe and their guests that evening, whom they had invited for their Walter Mondale presidential victory party and Plato's Retreat South mixer at our modest home in Hollandale, Florida, not far from the racetrack. As the first returns came in, and it was clear that the amiable dunce was going to swamp the full Norwegian in a way not seen since the hated Tricky Dick clobbered the first real progressive since Woody Wilson, that would be George McGovern, the grown-ups were disconsolate. I mean, suicide was mentioned, and not in the usual good way. You would have thought that Liebknecht had been shot again, and that Red Rosa Luxemburg had just gotten fished out of the Landwehr Canal. It was like the end of Die Welt, a historic wipeout from which the forces of good would never recover. Well, you know the rest of the story. We always recover, and how we did it was simple. We turned fat old Tip O'Neill's tiresome bromide about how all politics is local right on its head. Instead of going door to door like some cheap Chicago alderman with a basket full of promises in his handout, we took advantage of our increasing majorities among academics and journalists and began to focus everyone's attention on Washington, D.C. Okay, so your alderman was a crook, your mayor a corrupt idiot, your governor headed to the hoosegow, and, of course, they were all Democrats. So what? We convinced you that the only place such problems could really be solved was the District of Columbia. And that, my friends, was all it took. That's where we revolutionaries Moncay built upon the efforts of Tammany Hall and the Chicago Machine and the Red Brigades and the various People's Liberation Whatsits. By gradually narrowing the focus of everything in the country to Washington and Washington alone, we were able to reduce the United States from a giant continental-sized country to the 68.3 square miles of the District of Columbia, a place so special that for centuries, many of the laws that the 50 states had to follow didn't even apply there, where the Congress controlled the city government, where the taxis charged by the zone instead of with a meter, so that congressmen could get from their apartments to their favorite saloons and bordellos to Capitol Hill, all for one low price, whereas the tourists got soaked crossing Constitution Avenue. By nationalizing the media, by turning the Washington bureaus into the only game that mattered, we laid open the way for nationalizing everything. And we couldn't have done it without the seminal destabilization of the cultural norms and verities by our elite colleges and universities. Because Derrida and Foucault and all the other guys whose names neither I nor Rush Limbaugh can pronounce were right. Reality is a construct, a game, and the text is meaningless, as we'll see in our discussion of the Constitution in Part 2, except insofar as we give it meaning. There is no concrete right or wrong, just an infinite number of shades of gray. The truth is not a rock, but only one mirror in a wilderness of them. Your faith, your culture, your country are nothing more than an illusion, of which we are here to disabuse you. It's not like it was back in the 1960s, when the professoriate could expect at least some benighted fools, or students of principle, to resist the deconstructionist matrix. Not only was my generation open to their progressive ideas, they were already there, in embryo, implanted by our parents in the state-run grade schools, ready to be brought into full flower. We could move from home to the classroom, to the dorm room, to our first off-campus apartment, without ever encountering a single voice of opposition. A voice that, were it even to be heard, would surely be that of an ignorant, unlettered, racist bigot, most likely from the South. And this is our view of you, our Weltanschauung, as the Germans say, a word I learned in my Hegel classes, that if you are not with us, you are against us. There can be no agreement, no bipartisanship, no middle ground. When you reach across the aisle, you'd better be prepared to cross it irrevocably, or else you can expect to lose at least your hand, and probably your entire arm. The only kind of bipartisanship we desire is the same kind that animated the cowboy, Reagan, in his unfortunately successful campaign to bring down our beloved Soviet Union. We win, they lose. And unless you stop us pretty quickly, that's the only kind of bipartisanship you're going to get.
And that was the end of Chapter 9 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by, I believe his real name is it's not David Kahane, it's Matt Walsh or Michael Walsh, one of the two. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades. 40 tactics to defeat the radical left.
These ephemeral allies are able to make use of each other and aid each other, despite their natural opposition, in bringing about a mutually desired intermediate goal on the way to divergent final goals. The radical camp is full of coalitions. Anarchists and statists, feminists and Muslims, nation-states and illegal immigrants, trans rights activists and women's rights activists. All of these groups are naturally antonymic, yet all are cooperating to swing the culture leftward. Once they have defeated their common ideological enemies, they will battle each other for supremacy, like the communists fought with the Nazis for control of the left in post-World War I Germany. However, coalitions are anathema to the retrograde. The retrograde knows that he can do no evil so that good may come of it, that ends never justify means. The retrograde does not want to help, even accidentally, even far in the future, others achieve goals that are dissonant with his own ideology, which he considers sacrosanct. Instead, he wants to band together with like-minded men, so that in a true spirit of solidarity, they can intertwine their lives and honor in service of a common ideal, in service of those things which are transcendental, objective, and eternal, truth, goodness, and beauty. There's something treacherous and hateful to the man of goodwill to one day fight alongside a man that on the next day he will oppose. Further, as rooted as the retrograde is in Christianity, he knows that men are never to be viewed as means to an end, but only as ends in and of themselves. He therefore desires not to make use of other men, but to serve alongside them, sharing conviviality, mirth, sorrow, joy, and the full range of human affect en route to final communion. Beyond these abstractions, there is a simple and gritty fact that the retrograde should take time to digest. In the long run, coalitions don't work. While fellowships are by nature relational, coalitions are mechanical. Coalitions are prone to factiousness and infighting, since maintaining order and cohesion in a body made up of a motley assortment of ideological actors with deviating interests is an exercise in futility. True friendships are grounded in a pair's mutual love of truth and virtue. In a coalition setting, where most have disparate understandings of truth and misapprehensions of virtue, authentic friendship will be scarce and morale will suffer for it. It is axiomatic that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The links of a chain forged without friendship are brittle and rupture readily. So, since coalitions aren't predicated on authentic friendships, they can only be effective in the short term, till they collapse in cannibalism. Like Master Yoda says of the dark side, when Luke Skywalker asks if it's more powerful than the light, no. Quicker, easier, more seductive. Although coalitions can quickly be assembled, since it's easy to find a group of men who share at least one interest in common, they're in constant danger of civil war. Since fellowships are predicated on friendship and ideological harmony, they're more difficult to form, in that it takes time to locate a group of substantially like-minded men, but they have a staying power and indomitable strength. On the pragmatic level, eschewing coalitions is a short-term sacrifice for long-term success. Retrogrades must demand ideological purity and uniform commitment to virtue in their ranks. It's the ultimate poison pill to increase our numbers while compromising our resolve. Commit to building fellowships with quality men. Vigorously discriminate against wolves in sheep's clothing. We will ultimately win the day by presenting a united front girded with holy fraternity and steadfast resolve. Only then, in full bloom, will we be equipped to overpower coalitions of radicals, which are like mad dogs that bite indiscriminately.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, Rule 12 from Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Killing industry. Through moguls like Tim Gill and David Geffen, the homosexual lobby has become one of the biggest revenue streams for the American left. Leftist cultural enclaves like Hollywood that are the most hostile to any form of Judeo-Christian moral tradition have embraced lifestyles that healthier civilizations have traditionally referred to as immoral and discouraged. However, with the help of Hollywood liberals controlling most of the messages conveyed in pop culture nowadays, they are working hand in hand with one another to soften the American people's resolve to accept homosexuality as normal, despite losing 89% of the referendums on the definition of marriage. In the press coverage of the 2012 election, it was reported that 1 in 6 Democrat fundraising bundlers for Obama was homosexual. The third pillar is government education. The government schools K through 12 and on into college have essentially become the youth ministry for secular progressives. It is here, with the aid of pop culture, that they have established their feeder system to replenish their ranks every generation. As the longtime former attorney for the National Education Association admitted at his retirement party in 2009, NEA and its affiliates have been singled out because they are the nation's leading advocates for the type of liberal economic and social agenda conservatives find unacceptable, unquote. Some, like David Horowitz and my friend D. Ray Moore, have been sounding the clarion call to confront this for many years. But it's sadly fallen mainly on deaf ears within the majority of the conservative movement. I know of one major evangelical author and speaker who had a book manuscript rejected by one of the biggest organizations in the conservative movement, because in it he confronted the leftist indoctrination in our schools. The fourth pillar, government sector employee unions. Now this is the mobocracy the American left uses to intimidate Republicans into caving into more big government. And groups like AFSCME provide the worker bees / ground troops for the left's army in the culture war. They are the most dedicated foot soldiers they have. And why wouldn't they be? If your livelihood depended solely on the continued growth of government, you would be as well. Look at what the left has delivered for them in states like California and Michigan. Education bureaucrats in Detroit don't have to worry about losing their jobs despite the fact only 7% of the city's 8th graders are reading proficient. That's right. I said 7%, as in a 93% failure rate. In 2009, the Detroit School District had the lowest scores ever recorded on the National Math Proficiency Test. If you produced those kinds of results in your industry, wouldn't you expect to be fired? By the way, according to the New York Times, 95% of Detroit school kids are black. So it's obvious the Democrats have delivered on their promises to help the minority community. Or not. Then there's California, whose 245,000 government employees is easily the most in the nation. Those workers are paid an average annual salary of over $60,000, plus a rather generous benefits package. In 2011, California taxpayers shelled out $963 million in overtime pay to government employees, which was more than the next 7 states on the list combined. These are just some of the reasons why the average California state employee makes 30% more than the same job pays in the private sector. There is no way to preserve freedom, liberty, and prosperity for future generations without confronting these 4 pillars of the welfare state. It's been a long time since conservatives, let alone Republicans, have truly threatened the left's power base. Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin has successfully taken on the government sector employee unions in his state, and may be the only Republican I can think of to successfully dismantle one of these 4 pillars. Some estimates are reporting AFSCME in Wisconsin has lost at least 40,000 members since Walker ended mandatory union dues. Now you know why they have fought so hard to get rid of him. You know the difference between someone like Walker and someone like New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who National Review admitted wasn't a conservative no matter how many times Ann Coulter tried to convince us otherwise? Look at the way the left has reacted to Walker, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at him. On the other hand, while Christie shows some bravado at his town halls, you don't see the left trying to get rid of and intimidate him the way they are Walker. In fact, Christie played a pivotal role in aiding Obama's re-election. Walker is really fighting these people. Christie is just shadowboxing. At the time this book was being written, Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal was attempting to duplicate Walker's leadership by dismantling the government education pillar in his state.
And that was the next section of Chapter 2 from Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Bishop Robert Barron.
You're not just dumbly here or a result of a cosmic accident. No, you've been willed into existence by God. Why did he create you? Because he's got a mission for you. Hey, it might not be what the world thinks is important. Who cares? What's your mission from God? Might be the quietest thing. It's little in the eyes of the world, but great in the eyes of God. Now, here's the point. Once you understand what that is, Move. Act. Don't procrastinate. Don't fall asleep. Go in haste. Don't waste time. Life is short and the mission is clear. Be about the work the Lord has given you to do.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand quote of the day.
And you believe that there should be no right by the government to tax. You believe that there should be no such thing as welfare legislation, unemployment compensation, regulation during times of stress, certain kinds of rent controls and things like that.
That's right. I'm opposed to all forms of control. I am for an absolute, laissez-faire, free, unregulated economy. Let me put it briefly. I'm for the separation of state and economics, just as we had separation of state and church, which led to peaceful coexistence among different religions after a period of religious wars. So the same applies to economics. If you separate the government from economics, if you do not regulate production and trade, you will have peaceful cooperation and harmony and justice among men.
And that was Ayn Rand, the Ayn Rand quote of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little Vivek Ramaswamy.
Look abroad. Who's our real enemy? It's not Ukraine. It's communist China. And today, we depend on our enemy, China, for our entire modern way of life, from the shoes on our feet to the phones in our pockets. You want to fix that? This is how we declare economic independence from communist China. That is the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson would have signed if he were alive today. That is the Declaration of Independence that we need to sign to move this nation forward. Independence from semiconductors, from pharmaceuticals, from our military equipment here in this country that we depend on. We cannot depend on our enemy for our modern way of life. Shut down the deep state at home. Declare independence from China abroad. But then we get to the real problem for how we win this war. We have to revive national pride in the United States of America. Young Americans, we are lost. I'm 38 years old. I'm the youngest person ever to run for U.S. president as a Republican. And I will tell you what is going on in our generation. We are hungry for a cause. We are starved for purpose and meaning and identity. At a time in our national history when the things that used to fill that void, faith, patriotism, hard work, family, these things have disappeared. That leaves a black hole in our hearts. And when you have a black hole that runs that deep, that is when the poison fills the void. Wokeism, transgenderism, climatism, COVIDism, globalism, Zelenskyism, depression, anxiety, fentanyl, suicide. Do you think it's an accident that we see the rise of these same poisons at the same time in our history? It is not. These are symptoms of a deeper void of purpose and meaning in our country. And for a long time, we in our party, we have been running from something. Race, gender, sexuality, climate, without offering a vision of our own, individual, family, nation, God. We have been running from something. Now is our moment, though, to actually start running to something, to our vision of what it means to be an American today. Look abroad. Who's our real enemy? It's not Ukraine. It's communist China. And today, we depend on our enemy, China, for our entire modern way of life, from the shoes on our feet to the phones in our pockets. You want to fix that? This is how we declare economic independence from communist China. That is the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson would have signed if he were alive today. That is the Declaration of Independence that we need to sign to move this nation forward. Independence from semiconductors, from pharmaceuticals, from our military equipment here in this country that we depend on. We cannot depend on our enemy for our modern way of life.
And that was Vivek Ramaswamy. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the next chapter of The Enemies of My Country.
10. From his kneeling position, Worthy braced the buttstock of his suppressed HK-416 against his shoulder as he heard the flat plastic clack of David triple firing the initiation device behind him. A deafening explosion to his front blew a hole clean through the outer wall. With BK remaining in place, they had to assume the doors would be booby-trapped, and Worthy rose to charge through a cloud of smoke into the now gaping entryway. He'd already flipped his night vision upward, prepared to utilize his rifle-mounted tack light once inside the building. There were many advantages to using white light in close-quarters battle, the least of which was blinding your opponent before you shot them. But as Worthy cleared the hole on his way into the target building, he saw at first glance that he wasn't going to need his tack light after all. The interior was fully lit already, the windows taped over by sheets of black plastic. They'd been expecting a terrorist bed-down site, with their target asleep and defended by a personal security detail of 2 or 3 bodyguards. Instead, they'd stumbled upon a massive logistical operation in progress. 2 covered trucks were parked facing the closed bay doors, and Worthy saw in an instant that they were in the final stages of being loaded by what appeared to be a half-dozen Syrian men with assault rifles slung across their backs. He charged for the nearest cover, a waist-high metal crate 10 feet to his front, pivoting at the waist to open fire as he ran. Worthy wasn't concerned at that moment with precision fire, instead ripping rounds from his barrel as fast as he could pull the trigger. They were fully committed, and if he didn't get some suppressing fire down ASAP, David and Ian were screwed as they entered behind him. But Worthy had been first in the door for good reason. As a competitive shooter, his reflexes were without peer. His first 6 rounds were directed at a cluster of men behind the nearest truck, and he registered 2 of them falling forward as he transitioned his aim right. Unleashing another half-dozen bullets at the men behind the second truck, he didn't have time to evaluate the results. By then, he was slowing his forward sprint, crouching to take cover behind the metal crate as the first return fire began cracking around him. Cancer flowed through the demolished rear wall to encounter absolute chaos unfolding inside the building. The lights were on, problem number 1, and a startled Syrian man was in the process of wielding an assault rifle in his direction, problem number 2. Cancer dealt with the second problem first, bringing his suppressed HK-416 to bear on the man's chest and firing 3 times to drop him. Only then did he trip over something beneath him, regaining his footing to see a wounded fighter who'd been incapacitated by the explosive wall breach, or the rubble knocking him down, or both. Cancer ignored him, moving forward to bypass his first kill of the night, to the sound of Riley double-tapping the downed fighter in his wake. But then the real shooting broke out. Not the quiet, chuffing shots of his team's suppressed weapons, but wild automatic gunfire that exploded beyond the hall door to his front. Racing down the short corridor, he heard a frantic transmission from David. "Cancer, can you isolate the trucks?" "Stand by," Cancer replied, kneeling at the open doorway and angling his rifle around the corner, feeling Riley doing the same from a standing position behind him. His first glance at the central warehouse bay revealed stacks of metal crates, scattered and open on a dusty concrete floor, partially blocking his view of 2 covered flatbed trucks facing away. Men were piling into the backs of the vehicles, continuing to fire toward one side of the warehouse, the same wall through which Worthy, David, and Ian had entered. At the moment, isolating the trucks was out of the question. He'd be dead in 3 seconds if he broke cover, and Cancer gladly obliged the ISIS fighters seeking martyrdom by responding in the only way he could at present, as a shooter. Cancer took aim at one of the remaining fighters, shooting his weapon over top of the crate. What was it about terrorists, he wondered, that made them want to raise their guns over their head and fire without looking, and dropped him with a trio of rounds before directing his aim to the next standing figure. As the low man, Cancer restricted himself to targets on the warehouse floor, while Riley engaged enemy fighters on the backs of the trucks. Now the two team elements had the bad guys caught from perpendicular angles. Sure, they were grossly outnumbered by ISIS fighters, but establishing a crossfire was a good start. Cancer gunned down a man crouching behind one of the metal crates, then shifted to a fighter scrambling for the tailgate, lacing a burst into his spine and shoulder blades to drop him in place. Cancer was scanning for his next target when he heard the bark of the truck ignitions turning over in the confined space, and before he could consider the implications, the rightmost truck throttled forward. A shrieking scream of twisted metal erupted as the truck punched into the closed rolling door, ripping it from its tracks. The other truck followed suit, blasting through the second rolling door and out into the street. Ian reloaded his rifle as the sound of the trucks receded, leaning out from behind the crate to take aim. It was no use. The warehouse was empty, or very nearly so, save the open crates and scattered bodies lying amid smears of blood. David shouted, "Anyone hit?" A chorus of negative responses. The gunfight had lasted maybe 30 seconds, though to Ian it had seemed like half that. He'd certainly shot at enemy figures amid the din of battle, though whether he'd hit anyone was up for debate. The gunfight itself was his team's area of expertise. What happened in the minutes following that gunfight, or minute, singular in this case, was Ian's. David shouted, "1 minute for SE!" Ian scrambled to his feet, slinging his rifle and trading his grip for the small camera in his pocket. His task now was site exploitation, gathering as much intelligence as possible to feed back to the agency. Ordinarily, this meant prioritizing the collection of anything digital, cell phones, computers, hard drives, followed in short order by paper files and photographs. But tonight, Ian's focus was almost solely directed at the metal crates scattered across the warehouse. The air was rank with gunpowder and dust, vehicle exhaust and blood, as Ian took photos to document the number of crates. Each was olive drab in color, a sure indicator that they'd harbored military hardware. Ian flung one of the open crate tops shut, snapping a photograph of the yellow text atop it. As the rest of his teammates checked bodies for phones, radios, and documents, Ian heard David transmitting to their exfil driver, a local agency asset. "Cobalt, this is Suicide Actual. Be advised, 2 enemy trucks fleeing northbound. Do not approach the objective. We're bumping to exfil point Bravo 4, arrival in 10 mics. Cancer emptied a dead man's pockets as he called out, "Somebody tell me one of these bodies is BK." Ian knew without checking that wasn't the case. The masterminds didn't stick around to fight. Everyone his team had gunned down were foot soldiers whose final moments were dedicated to covering the leader's withdrawal, and even if Bari Khan had miraculously caught a fatal bullet in the opening salvo, they would have done everything in their power to take his body with them. Ian darted from open crate to open crate, stepping over the foam scraps of abandoned packing materials until he found what he'd been hoping to spot. One of the crates had some of its contents intact. It must have been the last one left to load before the team had made entry, and the enemy hadn't hesitated in abandoning it. Why should they? They already had the vast majority of their cargo aboard the trucks, which were now racing away from the warehouse to parts unknown. But Ian recognized the contents at once, correlating the number of crates to his memory of an intelligence report, with a growing sense of disbelief that his team had just stumbled upon something that the military community considered a statistical impossibility. David yelled, 30 seconds! "I've got UXO!" Ian shouted back, using the acronym for unexploded ordnance. "We need to blow it in place." David said, "Leave it. We're in Syria. They've got more UXO than they know what to do with." "Not like this," Ian said, snapping pictures of the crate's contents. David appeared at his side, momentarily speechless, then ran a palm across his forehead and said, "Well, shit." Embedded in the remaining foam packaging were 4 identical rockets, 3.5 feet in length, with body tubes ending in sinister-looking nose cones. "PG-9? David asked. "Worse," Ian replied. I'll explain later. You have what you need? Yeah, serial numbers and batch codes. We can go. Expel, David yelled, readying a grenade to drop in the crate. Get back to our gear. We're diverting to Bravo 4.
And that was Chapter 11 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.